CANQATE, Mr. Curtis Floyd. I therefore welcome Mr. Curtis Floyd, our President, to deliver some remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Vincent Alexander, our immediate past president of CANQATE. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This evening, as Mr. Alexander said, marks the first in a series of webinars being planned by CANQATE. With the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, many organizations around the world have been utilizing webinars as an approach to maintaining contact with and disseminating information to their stakeholders. Some of us at times might feel we are being bombarded by webinars and probably may have had the option this evening to be a participant in some other webinar at this time or engaged in some other personal or family activity. However, you are here now, which is indicative of your interest and support. And for this, we thank you. As you are aware, around this time, we would have normally been engaged in our annual conference, which was scheduled to be hosted by the National Accreditation Board of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But the COVID-19 pandemic preempted these plans. As such, it was felt that this would be the opportune time to kickstart the webinar series. We aim to provide information that would be relevant to our particular Caribbean context and which would stimulate further networking among our various post-secondary and tertiary institutions and member countries. With the intervention of the team from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, being led by the energetic and enthusiastic Mrs. Decima Alexander Hamilton, former Senior Education Officer in the Accreditation Unit of the National Accreditation Board of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We have this evening a presenter who has unreservedly and courageously taken up the mantle to lead off our series of webinars. We are grateful for his commitment, and Mrs. Alexander Hamilton will have the honor shortly of introducing this esteemed presenter. We trust that what will be shared this evening will foster a yearning to learn more about the impact of this unanticipated and potentially crippling pandemic we are all being faced with, and how we in the Caribbean can utilize our individual and combined creativity to weather the storm, come out victorious, and influence best practice that can be adopted internationally. Ladies and gentlemen, I am cognizant of the time and your eagerness to get started. So without further ado, I thank you again for your interest and support and hope that you enjoy this evening's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for those timely and appropriate remarks at the commencement of this webinar, first in a series of such webinars. It's now my pleasure and honor to ask Mrs. Decima Alexander Hamilton, former Senior Education Officer, Accreditation Unit, National Accreditation Board of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, introduce our presenter, Mrs. Decima Alexander Hamilton.
Regional colleagues, good evening. Before I do so, I would like to recognize the presence of our chair, Dr. Rosalind Ambrose, the sitting Senior Education Officer with responsibility for accreditation, Dr. Tricia and Job Moses, other members of the planning team that had really anticipated hosting the rest of the region, I thank you, colleagues, for your continued support. Members of the Board of Directors for CANQATE, thank you very much for being on this evening. At this time, we pause to recognize our presenter. I shall briefly touch on his previous positions, those that he holds at the moment. I would briefly look at his special awards and then his qualifications, because I believe, having heard those, you would realize that he was best suited to start this series. Okay, I will just touch in the interest of time. As I said, his previous positions. Dr. Ferdinand is a very active person. He has been a director of the RBTT Bank of the Caribbean Limited. He is a director of the Foundation for the Development of the Caribbean Children, honorary consul to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I believe that is to Spain, chairman of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, Distribution and Transportation Company, Chief Executive Officer of the East Caribbean Group of Companies. He has been manager of a group of companies, a group of entities, East Caribbean Feeds Limited, Sundry Poultry Farm, which is located in Antigua, East Caribbean Mariculture Limited, which is also located in Antigua, and East Caribbean Flour Mills. Those are what he held previously. I will quickly look at some of the things that he's currently doing. In 2004, Dr. Ferdinand started as a lecturer in strategic management. He taught and is teaching at the master's degree. 2007 to the present time, he is a business consultant. He also is a lecturer in strategic dynamics, doctoral degree program. He's a member of the campus council at Cave Hill campus of the University of the West Indies. He lectures also in global strategic management and innovation at the master's level. Lecturer in business strategy, again at the master's level. And I probably referenced at the time, but he's still chairman of the board of directors of RBC Royal Bank Holdings in the East Caribbean Limited. By way of his special awards, which I find intriguing, Dr. Ferdinand just a pause. Yes, Dr. Ferdinand is the holder of the Civil Order Cross, which he got from King Juan Carlos of Spain for outstanding service to the government of Spain on behalf of the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. As a Rotarian, he was able to achieve the Paul Harris Fellow Award. In 2014, Dr. Ferdinand gained the Best Lecturer Award from the Graduate School of Business, the University of the West Indies. In 2015, he was also able to repeat that feat, gaining that award once more. Finally, by way of his qualifications, he's very able, having heard his experiences, to speak to us tonight. At the moment, he holds a doctorate. He holds a doctorate in Business Administration from the University of Bradford in England. His thesis is competing on deregulations, survival strategies for food manufacturing firms in the Organization of the Eastern Caribbean States. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor on behalf of the National Accreditation Board of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to present to you Dr. S. Ferdinand.
Thank you very much, Decima. President Curtis Floyd and immediate past President Vincent Alexander and Dr. Ambrose, Dr. Moses, Decima, Alexander, and it would be remiss of me if I didn't also recognize Joan, who came on very early to make sure that everything was working smoothly. It's really my pleasure and my honor to spend these next few minutes with you on this topic, which is quite timely, the impact of COVID-19 on the tertiary level education, social and economic considerations. Now, I am very well aware that of these 37 persons who have already joined us, that you are all experts in your own right. And therefore, I look forward eagerly to the discussion section at the very end, because that is where I am likely to learn from you. And so it's going to be a two-way type of interaction. Let me just do the share screen now and walk you through the PowerPoint presentation that I've prepared. And bear in mind that copies of this presentation will be available to you. It's not a problem at all. And we'll talk about how you can get that at the end of the presentation, if you so desire. So let me do the share screen now. So you should be seeing the cover page there, the impact of COVID-19 on tertiary level education and its implications. Let me say here that when I was invited to do this presentation, I immediately started to look for some data so that in addition to giving you my own take on it, my own ideas, my own thoughts on it, that I could give you some data. Unfortunately, a lot of the data that I was looking for is not yet available. As recently as yesterday, one of my colleagues at the Open Campus had been trying to pull some information from the Open Campus. But be that as it may, in the absence of the data, I think we have some very interesting thoughts that we can share as we go forward. Now, as I go through the presentation, which would probably take us maybe about half an hour, 45 minutes, if that long, you will see a lot of graphics. What I found over the years is that the use of graphics really would help to cement the learning exercises that we're going through. So it's not to make it seem infantile, and it is not to pretty up the presentation, but it is to help the whole learning process as we go through. For those persons who are actively engaged in teaching, you would know that it is said that in learning, normal persons, normal quote unquote, persons who have not had trauma to the brain, either physical or chemical activity there, persons who have all the senses intact, they claim that 85% of what we learn is somehow linked to what we are viewing, what we are seeing. And so over the years, I found it very useful to incorporate graphics in the presentations, and it has helped, in my opinion, to enhance what is retained. So in terms of the agenda that I would want to take us through, in the introduction, I would want to share some general thoughts about education so that we lay the platform in terms of where we want to launch off into. And then we talk a little bit about the details revolving around COVID-19 in CARICOM. Not very extensive, but just to put in the context the thoughts that we want to share. And all of us are aware of the disruption that has been created by COVID-19. And sometimes we will get into panic mode when we think of the disruption. But a lot of good has come out of it. And we want to talk about some of that good in terms of what it has pushed us towards, especially at the tertiary level, in terms of enhancing our capabilities, especially as it relates to IT. And then that puts us in a position where we could look a bit at the shifting to online education. Before COVID-19, many of the institutions of higher learning in CARICOM had already been moving to a blended form of sharing of knowledge. Blended in the sense that some of it was face-to-face and some of it was online. COVID-19 has really speeded up that whole process, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then that puts us to share some thoughts in terms of some of the drawbacks in relation to what has happened, like the loss of social interaction. Online, while it has its conveniences, it also has its drawbacks. And it's so very important that those of us who are facilitating courses at that level and those persons who are administrators are conscious of this situation and will, as best we can, seek to create opportunities for the interaction among the participants to take place. That is where a lot of the learning is cemented, and that is where opportunities are created for the transfer of knowledge. And so we need to bear this in mind even as we go forward. And close to the end of the presentation, I want to talk a little bit about some of the economic impact. How has COVID-19 impacted our institutions of higher learning? How has COVID-19 impacted the economic status of participants? And I use participants as opposed to students. And the reason why I do that is that normally when we think of students, we think of younger people. And I tend to use the description participants when we're talking about the persons who are involved in tertiary type level education. And then we would leave some time for us to have some discussion. And as I said in my introduction, I look forward to that because that is where I can learn most from you. Throughout the presentation, you will also see some quotations. I have found quotations to be very useful to give us something to hold on to. And even though some of the quotations that I will use are not necessarily directly linked to tertiary level education, not directly linked to COVID-19, they do give us some degree of inspiration and some degree of focus. And so as we look at the segment surrounding the introduction, I want to talk a little bit about some of the quotations that I want to introduce you to. Some of them you're familiar with. At least many of the persons that I've quoted, you would be very familiar with their lives, but we want to link it to how these next few minutes can impact all of us in a very positive way as we focus on what we need to do going forward. And the first quotation that I want to share with us is this one that comes from Nelson Mandela. And it is so very fitting that we start off the quotation with Nelson Mandela, a very interesting human being. And he says, education is the great engine of personal development. It is through education that the daughter of a peasant can become a doctor, that the son of a mine worker can become the head of the mine, that a child of farm workers can become the president of a great nation. It is what we make out of what we have, not what we are given, that separates one person from another. That is what drives so many of us as we engage in passing knowledge, as we engage in being administrators. And each of the participants here tonight will be able to testify that they, if they had a choice of a different career, could probably have had a much more lucrative lifestyle. But I remind all of us that when we engage in passing knowledge, when we engage in teaching, it is not what we get from teaching, it is what we become by teaching. And that is a useful thing for us to remind ourselves of, because other than that, we can become disheartened, we can get distracted by what appears to be the little pittances that may be coming from our involvement in education at every level. And there's another quotation from Nelson Mandela that I like to use when we talk about education. He says, education is the most powerful weapon we can use to change the world. Education has power. And what a blessing it is to see those of us who are involved in education in CARICOM being able to admire, treasure some of the fruits of our labor. Caribbean people have made a name for themselves and for our respective territories all over the world. And I wish sometimes we had more time to describe some of these individuals, like the Guyanese, who at 16 years old migrated to the United Kingdom, studied, worked with the telecoms company in the United Kingdom, and then was transferred to Africa and was largely instrumental in a lot of the innovation in telecoms in Africa. And some of you know who I'm talking about. It's Collymore. And sadly to say, Collymore passed away about a year ago. But what an icon for us to hold up. And we could talk about a lot more other accomplishments of Caribbean people. But through education, we can make a significant impact, positive impact, not only on the region, but on the world. Our people play on the world stage. So COVID-19 has created a detour in our systems, but we are not disheartened. Yes, it has slowed us down, but there is still a lot of good, and that is what I hope to show in the next few minutes. This quotation from Burgess and Severston is fairly recent. I pulled it from a document just about 2 or so weeks ago, and the quotation is here for our consumption. The global lockdown of education institutions is going to cause major and likely unequal interruption in students' learning, disruptions in internal assessments, and the cancellation of public assessments for qualifications or their replacement by an inferior alternative. This is the reality. COVID-19 has done this. And shortly, I will talk about how it holds true for some of our institutions in CARICOM, and in particular, with reference to the University of the West Indies. Now, as Decima had mentioned, for a number of years, I have been sitting as one of the Chancellor's nominees on the council of the Cave Hill campus of the University of the West Indies. And I will talk to you about some of our own observations as it relates to the IT backbone of the University of the West Indies, and in particular the Cave Hill campus, that has allowed it to survive this tectonic shock that has been brought on us by COVID-19. Kalam gives us this quotation: "Some of the brightest minds in the country can be found on the last benches of the classroom." And we reflect on the fact that it takes a skillful teacher, it takes a skillful lecturer, it takes a very observant educator to observe those bright ones who fade into the background, fade into the back benches of the classroom, and we need to develop techniques to pull them out. Now, this becomes a lot more challenging when we go online, because when you go online, in very many instances, it becomes difficult, not impossible, but difficult to keep our eyes on those who might fade into nothingness. That becomes a major challenge that we must bear in mind. But we gain useful insights and encouragement from Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, who reminds us to see the future and be prepared for it. And I think it is true to say that the University of the West Indies and many of the other institutions of higher learning in CARICOM had been moving in the direction of not only anticipating the future. Yes, maybe we had not anticipated COVID-19, but we had anticipated that it is possible for situations to arise that we don't plan for, that can create obstacles in our paths, but we have the wherewithal to overcome those obstacles. And so we are encouraged by his quotation: see the future and be prepared for it. Now, for those persons who are readers of the writings of Malcolm X,
I don't see why it needs
sorry, I thought somebody was coming in there. But Malcolm X too, in looking at the challenges that in particular the African Americans were facing in the United States, had said something similar to that. That as a people, it was necessary to anticipate the future and be prepared for it. And one of the ways of preparing for the future would revolve around education, and in particular, tertiary level education. But as we mentioned before, sometimes there are obstacles that will come along our path, and we need to develop the fortitude, the strength of character, the determination that regardless of what challenges we face, that we know that within ourselves and when we band together, we can overcome them. And I like the way Dr. Robert Schuller, in his book, Tough Times Never Last, but Tough People Do. That's a good book to read. Robert Schuller's book, Tough Times Never Last, but Tough People Do, where he describes many of life's challenges like mountains in our path. And we need to develop the strength of character to know that when we face those mountains, we must be prepared to climb over them, or we will maneuver around them, or we will tunnel right through them. It is not beyond us to overcome these challenges. And with COVID-19, it's not beyond us to make sure that our own education systems evolve so that we are overcomers of the challenges that we will face as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the final quotation that I want to share with you before I move into some of the meaty stuff of the presentation is from Venus Williams. She says, I don't focus on what I'm up against. I focus on my goals and try to ignore the rest. And those persons who have followed Venus's career, yes, we are very familiar with her sister, Serena, but Venus too, in her heyday, was a force to be reckoned with. Unfortunately, she has suffered many setbacks because of physical illnesses. And sometimes people have not realized that is what has actually slowed her down. But we are encouraged by her own determination. And she does this by not focusing on what she's up against, but she focuses on her goals and she ignores the rest. That focus becomes very important. That we set a goal and we move in the direction of making it come true, making it real. So we're up against COVID-19. We're still not out of the woods where that is concerned. But as Caribbean people, as Caribbean administrators in education, as Caribbean facilitators, we have what it takes to do well, even amidst the setback of COVID. So let's talk a little bit now about the COVID-19 challenge. And we know that this very infectious disease, COVID-19, first came on the scene in December 2019 in China. We in CARICOM became exposed to it in March. That's when many of our territories were really hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of the Caribbean territories closed their borders in an effort to keep it at bay. Here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we didn't need to close our borders. Now you say, Jules, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by you didn't need? And the way our Prime Minister would describe it, if all the other borders around are closed, technically your borders are closed too. So we technically tried as best we can to keep businesses going, to keep for quite some time to schools and churches, but it had its impact. We encouraged best practice as it relates to social distancing, as it relates to hand washing, as it relates to wearing masks. We encouraged it, but it also created quite a bit of disruption in the business sector, in churches and in schools. That was a challenge throughout CARICOM. Many of the institutions of higher learning had been forced, had no choice, but to close their doors physically and as best they can to try to keep the institutions going, and because of the commitment to the participants, to the students, as best we can to keep them focused and to keep them advancing their knowledge and their skills. I must say that the University of the West Indies and many of the other institutions of higher learning speedily introduced protocols that were related to working and studying from home. I could talk a little bit about that to emphasize the fact that there were several challenges. In some parts of CARICOM, we had situations where students did not have the necessary hardware. Fortunately, in many instances, there were international donors, and in some cases, government departments cranked up and they were able to pass on the benefits of some donations to the participating students. But we also had a challenge in many parts of the region as it relates to bandwidth. Now, I could tell you from experience too, that in the period March, April in particular, I had several cohorts that then had to move online. And from the business school, the Arthur Lockjack Global School of Business in Trinidad, we had students who were online in many of the rural parts of Trinidad and Tobago, in Guyana, and also in Suriname. And there were instances where, because of the monitors that we have as facilitators and lecturers, where you could actually tell just how strong the connection is in terms of the internet connectivity, you could actually see that some of the students would have been missing out on some segments of the presentation because of the limited bandwidth. So there were challenges there, but it was not beyond us to still take those participants through to a position where they could write exams. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the challenges we faced with those exams too. But we also had some challenges with some lecturers, some faculty who understandably would prefer face-to-face. I will admit, to me, face-to-face is the better option. But change is inevitable. And we must again commend in many of the institutions of higher learning in CARICOM that for the last 2, 3, in some instances 4 years, had been improving the skills and the abilities of faculty, bringing them more in tune with the technology. And because of that type of training, many of the faculty, many of the lecturers were readily able to go online almost full-time and facilitate the courses that are there. 1 or 2 members struggled, and those would have been persons who maybe unwisely had always assumed that the face-to-face was going to be available. But COVID has shown that that is not so. So there were challenges with some students, some participants, but there were also some challenges with lecturers and faculty. Let me talk a little bit. Again, it's not all negative. There's a lot of positive that came out to it. And I want to use the Caveville campus of the University of the West Indies as an example. It's a good example for us to look at. At the Caveville campus, they were successfully, they facilitated the transition to remote assessment. Now we're talking about remote assessment because of the time when COVID came on the scene. And we must commend the individuals who, over the years, have been investing time and effort and persuading the administrators to upgrade the technology in anticipation of challenges like this, even though we would not have known what the specific challenge would be. But in anticipation that something could happen, they upgraded, and therefore they were not caught off guard. And the records will show, when you do the internal audit of the IT system, that they maintained internal controls and security measures. COVID-19 did not have a negative impact on that. And there were no unplanned downtimes reported in that facility of the University of the West Indies. And because of the infrastructure that had been put in place, because of the vision that was created and maintained by successive councils, by successive principals, it held its own, despite the unusual, heavy demand for the facility. And so we commend the administrators. And even though I have been very pointed in highlighting the Cave Hill campus of the University of the West Indies, I know that the same was true at St. Augustine in Trinidad, at Mona in Jamaica, at the open campus that facilitates throughout the region. It was able to hold its own. And so we remind ourselves that, and it's a useful reminder of the word in Mandarin that stands for crisis. This is what it is. But it's a combination in Mandarin. It's a combination of two words. Crisis in Mandarin is a combination of two words. The first word represents danger. And maybe when you look at that drawing, you say, Jules, that looks like a sword, and a sword could be dangerous. Maybe that is what it is, I don't know. But the second word is opportunity. So crisis presents danger, but it also provides opportunities. Sometimes we can become so focused on the danger that comes with a crisis that we lose sight of the opportunities that are created. And what I've just shared with you so far encompasses this. COVID-19 has been and continues to be a crisis, but in the danger of COVID-19, there are many opportunities. And we have seen at the tertiary level throughout the region, we have seen opportunities arise as a result of COVID-19. So we can talk a little bit about that, but it's good to have this as foundational. And even though we're talking COVID-19 and tertiary level education, this is a lesson for us as it relates to life in general. Many times when life hits us on the blind side, we could be so focused on the danger that is in this crisis that we lose sight of opportunities that are there. So that becomes one of our takeaway for tonight. And if it is one thing I would invite you to take away from this presentation, it is that we look differently at the crisis. Whether it is a crisis in our homes, whether it is a crisis in our workplace, whether it is a crisis in our education system. Yes, there are dangers there, but there are opportunities. And we as a people need to rally around the strengths that we have. We have a lot of strengths. We have accomplished a lot. So we tell ourselves that as Caribbean people, we can do it. Let's talk a little bit now about the disruptions in learning. So we know that in every crisis lies the seed of an opportunity. In every crisis lies the seeds of many opportunities. We just have to look for them. So let's look now at the disruptions in learning. And you are much more familiar with some of these than I am. So I'm just throwing these out. And again, I remind you, I so look forward to the discussions at the end of the presentation where our own insights in relation to these. And so I look forward to learning from you. So in terms of the disruptions in learning, we know that many schools, colleges, and universities were rightfully closed. And I underscore rightfully. They were rightfully closed. We couldn't take the chance. We couldn't take the risk. We focused so heavily on reducing contact and saving lives, regardless of what other people and other societies may want to say. COVID-19 is a killer. And every effort had to be made to reduce the contact and to save as many lives as we can. And so homeschooling became popular. But homeschooling requires discipline to cope with the distraction. In addition to which, some of the points that I made earlier on about the challenges with hardware and the challenges with bandwidth, and also in some instances, the absence of camaraderie can make working and studying from home very difficult. We as a people are social beings. It's not the same to be encouraging each other through email messages and through WhatsApp. Yes, it is better than nothing, but it is not the same than when we could eyeball each other and when we can encourage each other and when we can teach each other going forward. So there was some disruption of the learning there. And this would have had a negative impact as it relates to the socializing of some of the participants. And with online learning, many lecturers, many facilitators develop the skills and the techniques in terms of creating breakout rooms online. And it's not that difficult to do, but a breakout room online is not the same as a breakout room when you could send some in a corner here, some in a corner there, and you could observe them and you could anticipate if things are not working out just as well as you want them to, and you could intercept with intent. And that's an expression that I like to use very often. Intercept with intent, that we observe what is taking place and we can intercept. We can magnify the learning. We can intensify the interaction in there. It's not the same online. So let's talk a little bit now about that shifting to the online education. Shifting to online education. As I mentioned earlier on, many institutions of higher learning had already moved to blended learning, where some face-to-face and some online. And in those cases, it became a lot easier to facilitate the continuation of the learning process. So many lecturers and many teachers were required to speedily adjust to online facilitation. In some instances, it was untested and unprecedented. And we mentioned already the challenges that were faced with bandwidth and the limitation that some facilitators would have had in terms of transferring the knowledge and the skills via that mode. What I can say though, that through that whole aspect of distance learning, many facilitators were able to gain and intensify that capability rather speedily. But part of the challenge remained in terms of how do we do the assessments. And student assessment, in some instances, also moved online. I know that in some of the tertiary level institutions throughout the region, and as I said, you are experts in accreditation, you are experts in administration, and you could very well share your own insights in terms of what you did or what you are doing to help to mitigate some of the challenges that we have there. I know that there's some tertiary level institutions that decided to discontinue exams totally. So there were no exams. Others moved the exams online, and you had what is referred to in many instances open books, an open book exam, where the participant was given so many days to respond to the questions, they could do the research and so on. But that too is fraught with challenges, because you could have a student who is tempted and gives into the temptation to get a consultant to do their responses for them. We would like to think that all of our students are honest and all of them would practice integrity, but they are not all honest. And that becomes a sharp underbelly to the type of open book examination situation. And we would have had situations, as I mentioned, where some of the institutions, rather than take the risk of having the participants do online exams or open book exams, just decided to postpone the examination to a more convenient time. Now, that kind of postponement has its own challenges, has its own drawbacks, because you're talking about students, you're talking about participants who would be delayed in terms of their qualifications. And that delay in the qualification could very well mean a delay in a promotion or a delay in obtaining a particular job that requires that certification. So those would have been some of the challenges. Let's talk a little bit now then about the social interaction and the loss of social interaction. It's straightforward in terms of how that will happen, where it just retards the transfer of knowledge that would normally take place when participants interact with each other. And when lecturers and facilitators are physically present to have conversation with participants, that will help to enhance and intensify that knowledge. That, in my opinion, is a serious drawback. And I say in my opinion, because I have found, as a rule, when I'm engaged in face-to-face facilitation, I try to get to the lecture room at least an hour before the starting time. And I do that, one, to make sure that all equipment is working, so that if there's a problem, I could have it solved before we start promptly at the time given. And two, it provides an opportunity for participants to interact with the facilitator. And I will admit that very often, that is when I learn from the participants, because these are experienced persons. They come with skills and abilities and talents and experiences that may be far superior to mine in a particular area. And I learn from them, and they would learn from me in terms of my sharing my experiences. So that social interaction was certainly lacking, and we emphasize the need for that cross-fertilization of knowledge and those informal discussions that will take place before the session, during break, during lunch, and so on. So all of those are things that we would have borne in mind. So let's talk now about the economic impact. And this brings me close now to the end of my presentation and opening up, getting ready for the discussion. I think it is obvious, it is straightforward that the COVID-19 has had an impact on the economy of states, island states, nation states, but also it has had an economic impact on the institutions that provide this tertiary level knowledge transfer. So when we look at the economic impact, some lecturers, unfortunately, have been furloughed, they've been laid off, and others have seen, in some instances, a drastic reduction in their take-home pay because of the reduction to the classes that they facilitate. So it has had an impact on administrators, it has had an impact on lecturers and facilitators. But they're not the only ones who have felt it. Some students, many students, and again, I apologize that by the time I finished preparing for this presentation, I did not have the data to back up this statement, that some students have had to drop out as a result of losing their income. And I think if we do the analysis, and maybe it would be necessary to do the analysis subsequent to tonight, we are likely to find that many of the students who are disadvantaged this way are female. And we could talk about that in the discussion if that becomes necessary. But we also understand that with the slowdown of the graduation, with the delay, with the postponement of graduation, some participants will find that some of the job opportunities have vanished or they have been put on a back burner, and some of the promotions that had been pending are now going to be delayed. So COVID-19 has had its economic impact on the tertiary level participants and administrators as well. We understand that as it relates to the institutions themselves, many of the fixed assets are not fully utilized, and that has implications for the institution itself. Because you still have the carrying costs, but you now have, in addition to the carrying cost, you have a reduction in the revenues that those assets would generate. And we understand that the ancillary services will also be impacted negatively. So we don't need as many cleaners. The restaurants that are associated with the institution are closed. In some instances, the banks that are physically located on campus would be having reduced staff, or in some instances, they may even temporarily close, anticipating the return of the students. So I go back again to this quotation from Burgess and Sievertson as we think of the challenges that are ahead of us. We understand and appreciate that the careers of this year's university graduates may be severely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. They have experienced major teaching interruptions in the final part of their studies. They are experiencing major interruptions in their assessments. And finally, they are likely to graduate at the beginning of a major global recession. And we could add to that, in a climate, in an atmosphere, in a setting when jobs are difficult to come by and promotions have been stagnated. So that's the last quotation that I have for this evening. No, second to last. There's one more quotation that I need to bring to you. But in wrapping it up, in summing it up, we understand that there are challenges that we face and that we will continue to face as a result of COVID-19. But there are also opportunities that will be created. And my invitation to all of us is to be more focused on the opportunities that will arise. Be more focused. Yes, the challenges are there, but there are also a lot of possibilities. there are a lot of possibilities for how we transfer knowledge. There are a lot of possibilities for how we interact with the participants and with our colleagues. There are a lot of possibilities for us to create, for us to shape, for us to polish and shine a new type of education system. My last quotation comes from a former Prime Minister of England. He was the Prime Minister during the Second World War, who gave a lot of hope to the people of England when the Germans were bombing the daylight out of them. The quotation that I'm going to share with you is, even though it is taken from the context of that type of challenge, can be translated to the challenge that we now face. And here it is, from Sir Winston Churchill. We have not journeyed all this way across the centuries, across the oceans, across the mountains, across the prairies, because we are made of sugar candy. We, the people of the Caribbean, have come through a lot. And we have not only survived, we have thrived. And my challenge to all of us is that despite the challenges created and sustained by COVID-19, our administrators in education, our members of the accreditation boards throughout the region, our facilitators will guarantee that this generation and the next will have excellent education opportunities, because we have not dropped the ball. We will continue to make sure that we give the best of ourselves, knowing that it is not what we get from giving our best, but what we become by doing so. Thank you for being with me for this hour.
Thank you too.
I just open up now for any questions as I do the stop share and take us back to the main page. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that presentation. We are slightly challenged in terms of time. I think we have made the complete hour. I had indicated during the presentation in the chat that questions could have been posed. I have not discerned any question. I have not myself discerned any question. There are no hands up, so to speak, for questions. I would therefore like to suggest, in the circumstance that we still reserve the right to send in questions, and hopefully our presenter, Dr. Ferdinand, will be disposed to providing answers to those questions. Of course, that will have to be very cryptic, both in question and in answer, lest we impose too much on our presenter. But I would suggest that we do, in fact, take that approach. There's, however, one question that has popped up, and I would, in the circumstance, suggest that we look at that question, and that is, what do you think the future of tertiary education platform will look like post-COVID? And after that, there's one other question.
Yes, and I think it's a very is a very timely question too, and it's a question that a lot of persons have been asking. My own take on it is that post-COVID, we are likely to see a lot more programs online, and we're likely to see a lot more of the blended type learning. I say the blended type learning because I don't think we ever will, and I don't think we ever should get away from the face-to-face interaction. But I think post-COVID, what we are likely to see is that the tertiary level education may take the form where you have face-to-face early in the cohort, early in the module, and then successive sessions are likely to go online. And part of the reason for my saying that too would be due to the fact that I think it is true to say that many of the institutions of higher learning are going to be under pressure in terms of having less expensive, less costly programs. I think the pressure is already on. And by putting a lot of the content online and the facilitation online, that is one way that would also help to bring the cost down. So in terms of the cost and in terms of the availability and so on, I think we are likely to see more online programs and more blended programs.
Thank you. There's another question. It reads as follows: our responses to times of economic challenge are different from that in the literature. We tend to retract our participation in higher education rather than view the period as the time for retooling our skills. What is your advice, or how can we change our mindset?
You know, that's a very, very good question, a very good observation, something that we need to think about very deeply. I think it is true to say that many of the challenges that we face in the Caribbean are not new to us in the Caribbean. Yet COVID-19 is new, but many of the challenges are old challenges. And by that I mean, if we go back to Sir Arthur Lewis, who many of us know as one of the most accomplished economists that the Caribbean has ever produced. He got the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1979. And writing in the 1970s, Sir Arthur Lewis said, and I paraphrase, "We, the people of the Caribbean, are very good at observing. We are very good at analyzing, but we fall short of implementation." And I say that to say, in response to the observation there, that we have to make sure, and those of us in this forum are in a position where we can influence it. We have to make sure that we do not limit ourselves to merely being observers of what is taking place at the higher education level. But we need to come up with the solutions and make sure that they are implemented. And I think in responding to the first question, that feeds into the second one too, that we know what some of the solutions are, but we now need to make sure that we are proactive enough, that we are not just spectators, we're not just in the pavilion looking at the game played. We go out there and we beat ball, using cricket as an analogy. And so we as a Caribbean people, we as educators, we as administrators, we as persons who design and accredit the programs for tertiary level education need to take it the next step and make sure that we can implement a lot of these changes. I don't know if, but let me just say too, that whole thing with influencing, with changing the mindset is not likely to happen automatically. That whole process of changing mindset calls for a lot of discussions like this. It calls for administrators to brainstorm the types of situations and come up with specific detailed plans in terms of what we must do to influence the mindset and the attitudes. But it calls for communication, and it calls for persons who will have to make hard choices and push for change.
Thank you very much. There are two more questions, and in fact, I will make those the two last questions given our time constraint. The first of the two reads, how can we create equity in blended learning for all students?
That's a ticklish one, because a lot depends on how you interpret equity. And I say that I say that this way because we still have some disparity in education. And it's not that I'm being pessimistic, but I don't know if in my lifetime we will get over some of them. And what I'm referring to is the fact that you will in each Caribbean territory have schools and tertiary institutions that are perceived to be for the elite. And I'm not saying elite in terms of the disposable income. I'm saying elite in terms of the attraction and the retention of the brightest and the best. Now, we could debate it ad infinitum in terms of whether this should be or should not be. I don't know if we will ever get an answer to that. And I'm saying that in relation to equity. So I think we will always have some degree of disparity. But I think what we have to do as a people is to make sure that even those institutions that are perceived to be attracting and retaining the cream of the crop, that the other institutions have an opportunity to also create graduates that have almost as much of the exposure of the others. And maybe the whole online facility will be in a position to facilitate some of that. Where the differences may be is exposure to laboratories and that kind of stuff. But I would like to think, Godwin, that we still have a challenge in terms of creating that equity that you're referring to. But the blended education can lend to helping to make it possible. But in some disciplines, I don't think it would work in every single discipline. And my reason for saying that is those disciplines that require labs and expensive equipment and so on will always, in my opinion, have an advantage over the institutions that cannot facilitate those. But it's not unique to CARICOM. It's not unique to the Caribbean. I mean, the same thing happens in North America, for example. The same thing is happening right now, even as we speak, in the United States of America. But it's something that we probably, as a people, need to focus more in terms of how do we resolve it and how do we create some degree of balance and equity. Let me just say here too, that when we talk about balance and equity, we must not lose sight of the gender issue that revolves around equity. I think we have come a long way as Caribbean people, where we're creating more opportunities for our women, for our ladies, in sciences and in some of the other professions. We have, in my opinion, come so much further along the way than many developed countries in some of those fields, but it still calls for more equity in some of those. And I wish we had more time to discuss those as well.
All right, if I could just make one brief comment on the question of equity. It's apparent that blended learning does lend to equity insofar as the question of accessibility is concerned sometimes. People not having to come to a central place, being able to access education wherever they are. But at the same time, it poses a problem, which in the part you mentioned, on the availability of the gadgets and the technologies for access.
Yes.
Some people may not, in fact, though they can now stay at home and have access, not have the infrastructure, in
Yes.
fact, to access.
Right.
I had said I would take two more, one gone, and so I will now take the last of the two, though there is another question that's popped up. This one is pretty long. First, wish to thank Dr. Ferdinand for an excellent presentation. And I want to agree that COVID, the person has 119, sounds like emergency,
19.
has presented us with many challenges and opportunities. However, I wish to have Dr. Ferdinand's take on whether our course and curriculum designs are appropriate for blended learning as is.
I would respond by saying no, because I think it is true to say that the curriculum that we're operating now would have been designed prior to COVID and prior to the anticipation of these kinds of challenges. So I would like to think that it must be work in progress. And the sooner we could work on it, the better. So yes, I would think the curriculum right now needs to be redesigned. And it would be useful in doing this redesigning of the curriculum for us to anticipate as best we can what kind of training, what kind of facilitation that the persons who will be required to disperse the knowledge, so to speak, would be required to have to make it happen. But as it is, I think it would be true to say that the curriculum that we're operating with now in many of the Caribbean territories would not be taking COVID-19 into consideration.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ferdinand, for answering those questions, and in fact for your presentation, a presentation which posed the question of the negative and positive impact of COVID-19, but which said to us that things like COVID-19 are beyond our control. And we, in a sense, have to be able to respond and to take the positives forward and to try to negate the negatives. We just can't clasp our hands.
Yes.
We have to respond. I think you acknowledge that without COVID-19, some of the things that were being done were timely and have found a place.
That's right.
in the way forward. So in that regard, we are pretty fortunate. I would therefore like to take this opportunity in wrapping up to thank the National Accreditation Board of St. Vincent and the Grenadines for stepping forward in conjunction with the Caribbean Area Network for Quality Assurance in Tertiary Education to have this first webinar. Webinars predated COVID, but have been allowed us to respond as well to COVID. To thank you, Dr. Ferdinand, for availing yourself and being able to make such a useful presentation. There are two questions outstanding, and I'm going to suggest that what we do, it's our intention to post this webinar on our website, and we can, along with the posting of the webinar on our website, post short answers to those two questions. Yeah. I would like to thank all of our attendees for participating in this webinar, for the Board of CANQATE for their foresight in this regard, as well, and to use the opportunity now to bring this webinar to, I would say, a successful conclusion based on the presentation we've benefited from and based on the responses we've had, though limited time has not allowed us to have the kind of exhaustive discussion that Caribbean people will normally be engaged in. So colleagues all, attendees, organizers, presenter, thank you all for your participation, and we do look forward to your further engagement in similar webinars. Please be reminded, those of you who are members of CANQATE, that tomorrow morning at 10 Eastern Caribbean time, we convene for our annual general meeting. Thank you, stay safe, and have a good night.
Thank you too.